Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Smith, the director of the C.S. Lewis Institute Atlanta, and I want to welcome you this evening to our presentation and discussion of The Magician's Nephew. This is actually the sixth of these discussions and presentations from the Chronicles of Narnia, and we've had a great time. So I'm excited to be here this evening. Just a few words before we get started here, and I introduce Joe, and then Joe will take it from there. I just want to say a few words about the C.S. Lewis Institute. We're in the legacy of C.S. Lewis. We're developing disciples who will articulate, defend, and live faith in Christ in personal and public life. And we do that through sponsoring events such as the one that we're having tonight. Many of them are live. COVID has forced us to do many more of them by Zoom, but this enables us to connect with people all over the world. So it's been a pleasure to have people from all over the world join us for these events. And one of the things that we do also is produce resources which are posted on our website, and you can check out, I encourage you to check out our website at www.cslewisinstitute.org. And there you can get all kinds of information about events that are going on in our various cities. We have 16 extensions all over the world. So maybe you're in a city where we have an extension or close by, and you can check those out. I just mentioned one of the things we do is a couple of podcasts, and one of those is called the Side B podcast that Jana Harmon does, where every other week, she interviews a former atheist who is converted to Christianity. And I think you'd find those stories very enlightening and encouraging. So take a look at that podcast. Randy Newman also has a podcast there where he interviews Christian authors and Christian scholars. And so either one of those I think you'd enjoy. Check out also the Fellows program, which is a 1 to 2 year discipleship program. And then I'll mention also here in Atlanta, we're doing a course, we're calling it Further Up, Further In. That phrase which comes from the last of the Chronicles of Narnia, the last battle, at least the last in the series as we're doing it here. And that is actually a study of the life of Lewis, first of all, the life of Lewis through reading a book about Lewis, and then we'll focus on mere Christianity. That's a 4-month course. And if you'd be interested in that, if you live in the Atlanta area, check that out. And we'd love to have you be a part of the C.S. Lewis community as we go through and discuss mere Christianity. So with that, Joe, I'd like to just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Many people who will be on here have been on one of these before, but there'll be some new folks. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then take off with The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah, great. Well, I trust that many of you have been with us for the last 5 books as we kind of close in on the final 2. But I'm Professor Dr. Joe Rigney, Pastor Joe. I live in Minneapolis. And where actually a new piece of news, about 2 weeks ago, I guess, was my first day as the president of Bethlehem College and Seminary. So that was we've known for a while, but my first day was June 1st. So we're a small Christian liberal arts college and seminary that in our college focus on great books in light of the greatest book for the sake of the Great Commission. And so this is actually a pretty good example of what we're doing here with Lewis as we look at some great books, these Chronicles of Narnia, in light of the scriptures, also that we can be more faithful followers of Jesus and fulfill the Great Commission. So that's what I do. I'm also a pastor at Cities Church here in St. Paul. And let's see, I'm married to Jenny. I have 3 boys, 12, 10, and 2.5, Sam, Peter, and Jack, who is named after C.S. Lewis. And we're playing a lot of baseball these days. So that's a little bit of what's going on in our world. And so with that, let's just dive in here to Magician's Nephew. Now, As you know, I actually got in an argument with my son the other day. So one of his projects for the summer, my middle son, Peter, is to read through all of the Chronicles of Narnia, just read them through. He's gotten different ones at different times, but he's never just kind of started at the beginning and gone all the way through. So I discovered the other day, as he was beginning this work, he had begun with Magician's Nephew, because that's the one he had. It starts at number 1. And I said, Peter, that's not right. You know better. And he said, well, they say that C.S. Lewis wanted it, so you should do it this way. And I said, well, they're wrong. C.S. Lewis did say something like that in a private letter to a young boy. But this is a place where if Lewis meant that, Lewis himself was wrong. The Magician's Nephew does belong here as the 6th book. It was the order in which it was published. And if you read through it, you noticed there are a number of things in the book that indicate that it kind of assumes knowledge of the other books. There's a number of things in Magician's Nephew itself that demonstrate it's meant to be a prequel, which you watch or read after you've read the others, much in the way that if you were going to introduce somebody to the Star Wars movies, you would have them watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, and then perhaps go back and watch episodes 1, 2, and 3. But and then after you know the whole story, you can watch them in any order you want. That's fine. But in exposing people to them for the first time, it's best to start with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So a couple of elements there that are worth noting. All of a sudden, there's just this lion in the middle of the story singing, and which, if this is the first book you've read, you're kind of like, what's this all about? And then they mention his name, Aslan, and well, what's that all about? And so the book sort of assume you know who this is, that when you see the lion singing, you're going to go, I know who that is. And if you've read the other books, you would. The geography as they sing Narnia into existence and all of the other countries, and you get sand away to the south and kind of some mountains to the north and the sea to the east. There's an assumption there that you kind of know what these places are, that you've read The Horse and His Boy, and so you've been to the south. You've read Silver Chair, you've been to the north. You've read Voyage of the Dawn Treader and gone to the utter east. And so those are sort of little Easter eggs for people who already know the world of Narnia. And in fact, the Diggory and Polly comment on the fact that someday there's going to be histories of those places. Isn't that an amazing thing here at the beginning? That someday people are going to live there and there are going to be histories. And that's true, and it has a different effect if you've already read those histories than if you're coming to it with a blank slate. And then even at the very end, of course, the lamppost, when the lamppost is thrown, there's this is kind of an odd detail. Why did they have a lamppost grow up there? Well, if you've read the first book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you know that's the lamppost, and that's the effect I think Lewis intended to have is, oh, that's where the lamppost came from. As opposed to, why is there a lamp? Why did they just plant a lamppost in the middle of it? What does that have to do with anything? And then you would discover in the next book, if you read through it. So there's a number of things like that. And then of course, at the very end of the book, this is talking about the tree that was planted and in Diggory's backyard that grows up and then it gets knocked over by a storm. And then he, rather than making it firewood, builds it into a wardrobe and puts it in the big house. And he didn't discover the magic, someone else did. And then it says, that was the beginnings of all of the comings and goings between Narnia and our world, which you can read of in other books. So he even says in this book, that was the beginning. The beginning of all the comings and goings was the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, going through the wardrobe as opposed to here. So those are some little details. If you ever find yourself debating with a friend over what order they should read them in or how they should give them to their kids, I really do recommend starting with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. All right, so To Magician's Nephew itself is a story. Quick summary, then I'll highlight a few things, and then, of course, be keeping track of your questions for the end. This story takes place, 50 or so years before the events of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the rest. So those books took place sort of in the middle of World War II. That's why the kids have to go out to the country, and so early 1940s. So this is turn of the century England, in the days of Sherlock Holmes as the book opens up. This is actually the age in which Lewis would have been a young boy. So this is him going back to his childhood, which I'll show later is, I think, significant for the plot of the book. But we have a girl named Polly living next door to an old bachelor and an old maid. And then all of a sudden there's this little boy there named Diggory, and he's come to live there because his mother's ill. His father's away in India. And his mother's sick and is being cared for by her relatives. And he's very sad about this because his mother's probably going to die. And so that's the beginning of this friendship between Polly and Diggory, who over the summer discovered that, hey, our house, the house that we're in, these little the flats, house, townhome type situation, have attics that run the whole length of the row. And so you can get from one house to another without going through any doors. And so they're playing around up there, and they're going to try to get into a vacant house. And in the process, stumble into Uncle Andrew's study. And Uncle Andrew, of course, is Diggory's mad uncle. And he's in there, and he's got these little rings on his desk, and basically tricks Polly into picking one up. And as soon as she picks up one of the yellow rings, poof, she's gone. And this was all a plot to try to get her. He's a magician. He's discovered these rings. He's made them as a way of getting out of the world, of going to some other world. And he wanted to see, does it work? And he needed to do an experiment. So he sends Polly, tricks her into going, so that Diggory would then have to go get her and bring her back, which Diggory, being a dutiful young boy and a good friend, does. So he goes, and they discover the wood between the world, which is basically like the attic in which they live. So Lewis intentionally parallels those things. And that actually comes from Lewis's childhood itself. The house that he grew up in had sort of this kind of attic space where you could kind of get anywhere in the house by going to the sides under the eaves and making your way back. And so he had his own little fort, reading nook. He and his brother would spend hours up there. And so he's brought that from his childhood into this story. And the wood between the world is like that. It's an in-between place with all of these little pools that you can jump into to get to the world. Well, so now Diggory and Polly find themselves in the wood between the world. There's all these pools. They want to go home. And then Diggory says, well, hey, there's other pools. We should check some of those out, which they do. They go and they visit, and they come to the world of Charn, which is this aging place that has nothing alive in it. And there they encounter Jadis, the last queen of Charn, who had used the deplorable word to wipe out every living thing on her planet and then put herself into an enchanted sleep, which Diggory then hits a bell and wakes her up over Polly's objection. It's a key moment in the story that Diggory does that. So Jadis wakes up and wants to go back with the kids. They try to escape. She grabs their hair, Polly's hair, and makes it back to the wood, and then makes it all the way to England, where she proceeds to wreak havoc. She goes off with Uncle Andrew and wreaks some havoc throughout the streets of London. And then Diggory, again, wanting to put things right, uses the rings to get her and to try to get her out of our world, which he does, but unfortunately also brings with him a cabbie and a horse and Uncle Andrew. And then they jump into another pool to try to get away from the witch, who then follows them yet again. And then they come to this world where there's nothing there. It's just a completely empty world. It's a nothingness. And while they're standing there, all of a sudden there's a song, and there's this deep song coming from somewhere. And all of a sudden things start to happen. The stars come out and they start to sing. And then there's this voice, and the sun comes up, and they see over the hills and the valleys, and they see the lion singing the world into existence. And of course, this is the beginning of Narnia, as Aslan sings Narnia into existence and creates all of the rolling hills and the rivers, and then creates the animals. They kind of sprout up from the ground, and there's all the animals. And then Aslan proceeds to sort of choose from among all the animals to become talking beasts, and wakens them into rationality and speech. And the Jadis and Andrew don't like this place at all. Jadis runs away. And then in the process, the lamppost, she had brought a piece of a lamppost from England, throws it at Aslan, just bounces off his head. He doesn't even care. But when it hits the ground, it grows up into a new lamppost. And this gives Uncle Andrew the idea, hey, this place is pretty great. If we plant iron, we'll, grow, railway engines and or battleships or all kinds of stuff. We'll make lots of money. This is, money could grow on trees here, which it does. And this is the land of youth. This is the land of youth. And with the land of youth, Diggory thinks, oh no, could there be something here that would help my mom get better? She's sick, she's gonna die. Is there something here that can help? I'll go ask the lion. And before he can sort of ask his question, Aslan says, this is the boy who brought the evil into the world. He's the one who's got to put it right. And so sends Diggory on a quest to the west, to the western wild, to a great valley, a hill with a lake and a garden. And in that garden is a tree, and he's got to pluck an apple from it and bring it back. And that's going to be what protects Narnia from the witch that he introduced into the world. And so he goes, and while he's there, he meets the witch who's eating the apples. And she says, this apple will give you endless life. It could heal your mom. You should eat it. And of course, the warning was, if you eat this for yourself, you'll get what your heart's desire, but you'll also despair. And so Diggory's torn, faces the temptation, conquers the temptation, faithfully brings the apple back to Aslan, who then plants a tree as a protective tree, and then encourages Diggory to take one of the second, sort of second generation apples, the grandson apples, and take it back to his world. And that apple will make his mother well again. And of course, they go back to Narnia, go back to England, gives her the apple. She gets better. They all become friends. And then and of course, Diggory grows up to be Professor Kirk, who we meet in the other books. So that's kind of an overview of the story. There's lots of really interesting things in it. I'm going to highlight a few, maybe flag a few others for discussion later in our time. The first one I want to talk about is this contrast that Lewis draws. One of the things Lewis does a number of times in the Chronicles is he uses multiple characters to make a very profound point. So I think I talked about this when we did Prince Caspian. In that story, you have Truffle Hunter the Badger, who's faithful and true and believes the old stories. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got Nickabrick the Black Dwarf, and he's cynical and is willing to use anybody to fight off the Telmarines. He'll partner with hags and werewolves and ogres and all sorts of wicked creatures. So he's a mercenary, very practical. He's not faithful. And then Trumpkin's sort of in the middle. Trumpkin the Red Dwarf doesn't really believe the old stories, but he's noble and wouldn't never partner with the bad guys. And that sort of three-way contrast is meant to illuminate sort of different sorts of people, sort of faithful believers like Truffle Hunter, cynical co-belligerents. You don't really want to be allies with them because they're not trustworthy, as Nickabrick proves to be a traitor in the end. And then sort of this in-between guy of Trumpkin. So Lewis does this sort of thing in the books. In this one, he actually tries to show a spectrum of the same sin, but at different phases. So there's a certain kind of sinful desire, sinful activity that he shows in three different phases. And I'll show it to you in the two big ones, and then show it to you in the final. Uncle Andrew and Queen Jadis are meant to be paralleled with each other. Okay. And so there's a number of places in the book where this is demonstrated quite clearly. So when Diggory comes into the study and Polly gets sent out of the world, Diggory's very irate at this. How dare you? How could you possibly do this? And he says, "What do you mean? I use people. That's kind of what I do." And, you're rotten. And Uncle Andrew's kind of puzzled. Rotten? Oh, you mean little boys ought to keep their promises. That's true. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm glad you've been taught to keep your promises. But those sorts of rules are good for little boys and servants and women and normal people, but they don't apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. And in doing this, what Lewis is doing here is something very profound. In his book, The Abolition of Man, he talks about men without chests, men who have sort of cut their own heart out, cut their own humanity out in pursuit of conquering nature, who want to sort of rule the world and bend nature to their will. And so he says, so in that book, Lewis says there is what he calls the Tao, or the God-given order of the universe, the natural law. There's a way that God made the world, and the task of human beings is to conform ourselves to it, so that we should love what's lovable, hate what's hateable. We're beneath it. We're trying to conform ourselves to the way God made the world. Well, Lewis says that one of the modern temptations is to try to say, no, we're going to conform the world to our desires. What we want, we're going to make the world fit our desires. And in doing so, you get certain men, what Lewis calls the conditioners, who set themselves up over other men. And their desire is to sort of rule the world, to alter human nature. It's very relevant to our current day and age. But here's what Lewis says in that book. He says, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men, because they're going to change forever what human beings are. The attempt to conquer nature culminates in the conquest of human nature. Okay, so these conditioners want to refashion mankind. And so they have to relinquish their stake in it. They have to cease to be men. They have to step outside the obligations derived from God and the way he made the world and the ties that bind men together. And so that they can sort of break all the rules in order to remake man in their own instinctual desires. And so this is the end of man. So this means that we obey our basest impulses and our instincts rather than obeying God in the way he made the world. So this sort of idea is very pronounced in Lewis. The scientific conditioners who step outside of normal morality, and that's the mentality that Andrew is demonstrating. He's, you should keep your promises. I don't have to keep my promises. You shouldn't trick little girls into picking up dangerous things and sending them into danger. That's good. That's right. Little boys shouldn't do that sort of thing. I'm glad that you've been taught your rules. But I'm above the rules. The rules don't apply to me. And part of why Lewis does this, notice that he describes Uncle Andrew as a magician. That's how Uncle Andrew thinks. I'm a magician. I've learned magic. I know how to do magical things. But in doing that, Lewis is actually using magic as a stand-in for science. This is something he describes elsewhere in Abolition of Man. He says, the process whereby man surrenders object after object and finally himself to nature in return for power. So when you surrender your humanity in exchange for power, he says that's the magician's bargain. And he says that's what scientists are doing. The scientist succeeds where the magician failed. And so that makes us think that science and magic are two fundamentally different things. And he says, but that's not true. Modern science and magic were born in the same time period, in the late Renaissance, early Enlightenment, after the Middle Ages, 16th century. Magic was sickly and died. It didn't work. They couldn't figure out how to turn lead into gold, even though they wanted to. And science did. So alchemy and chemistry. So alchemy is trying to turn base metals into gold. And then chemistry, which we know is sort of this modern scientific discipline. The same people were doing both activities early on. And it's just some methods worked and others didn't. And so then we say, oh, they're different. Alchemy is totally different than chemistry, but they were birthed out of the same desire. Same thing with something like astrology and astronomy. So astrology is trying to discern the meaning in the stars and use the stars to gain power. Astronomy is simply studying the stars and how they move. The same people were doing those things, and then one method worked and one didn't. And Lewis's point is that both of them were born of the same impulse. Magic and modern science were born of the same impulse, namely turning the world into an object that we can use to suit our own desires. We use the world for our own ends, our own purposes, as opposed to trying to discover what has God made the world for. We're going to try to conform ourselves to it. And so we're not going to conform the soul to reality. We're going to conform reality to our desires. And in doing so, we're going to sort of lose our humanity. Well, that's what Andrew has done. He's stepped outside normal morality. He's willing to do all sorts of horrific things, including sending a little girl into danger in order to do it. Now, so he uses people. He has a hungry and greedy look. And what's interesting here is this is the same thing that we see when Jadis shows up. So when Jadis shows up, she has the same hungry and greedy look that Andrew did. She had to do terrible things in service to her power. When Diggory says, how could you do that to Polly? And Andrew keeps going, why do you keep harping on that? That's not what matters. You keep getting off the point. When Diggory objects, you use guinea pigs as subjects and some of them blew up. Animal experimentation, that's horrible. And Uncle Andrew says, well, that's what they were for. They were mine. I bought them. I could do whatever I want with them. I can use them for my own purposes. And so, and so then when they say the same thing when the Queen says, I uttered the deplorable word and killed all the people, they go, well, that's awful for those people. And she's kind of like, what do you mean? What? I was the Queen. They were my people. What else were they there for but to do my will? Like they exist to serve my will. And so if I want to snap them out of existence, I can do that because I'm the Queen. And in fact, she goes on. So this is earlier I quoted Uncle Andrew. And then she says, oh, I forgot that you were only a common boy. When Diggory sympathizes with the common people who were killed, I'd forgotten you were only a common boy. How should you understand reasons of state? You must learn, child, that what would be wrong for you or for any of the common people is not wrong for a great queen like me. The weight of the world is on our shoulders. We must be freed from all rules. Ours is a high and lonely destiny. So that phrase, a high and lonely destiny, that's the stepping outside of ordinary morality, putting yourself, basically trying to make yourself into God so that you can bend reality to your will, and other people have to obey the rules. And in fact, one of the funny things you notice, the ironies here throughout the book, is the way that whenever Uncle Andrew doesn't get his way, he always, like in other words, when Diggory won't do what he says, Uncle Andrew keeps saying, "You're just a very disobedient and impertinent little boy. You're being disobedient. You're being disobedient." But he himself doesn't believe there's any standard that we all have to obey. He can step outside the standard, but Diggory needs to do exactly what he says. So it's a inconsistent, contradictory sort of approach. Rules for you, but not for me. At the same time, he'll also use ordinary morality to his advantage as a tool of manipulation. So when he's trying to convince Diggory to go after Polly because he's sent her off the world, and Diggory's like, "Why don't you go?" He's like, "I can't go. I'm the great magician. What if something happened to me? All of my knowledge would be lost." And Diggory says, I'm not going to go. He says, "Fine. Well, then you just go tell Polly's mom that she's never coming back and she's probably dead. Go ahead, go tell her." And so he's appealing to a kind of compassion, a friendship, a loyalty in Diggory. He knows it's there. He knows that Diggory's going to feel the pull of obligation and duty by doing that, but he's using those obligations as a tool of manipulation. The queen does the same thing. When she's trying to get Diggory to eat the fruit and disobey Aslan, she says, "Don't you want your mother well again? Won't that make your father happy?" So she appeals to all of these good sentiments: love of mother, love of father, obedience to parents. She's appealing to all of these things, love of neighbor, in order to manipulate him into doing something that Aslan's forbidden. And so this is the common thread between Andrew and Jadis. They both would do anything for power. Okay, they both do anything for power. They'll dispense with anybody, use anybody. They're very practical. We're told a couple of times they're very practical people. They're working with things that they don't fully understand. Uncle Andrew is anyway. He was working with things he didn't really understand. And then Lewis comments, most magicians are. And if you just substitute the word scientist there, it comes through just as clear, right? Most scientists are working with things they don't understand, and they're willing to break rules. Think about what scientists these days are talking about with cloning or trying to make hybrids of humans and animals and all of this sort of stuff. They're willing to bend and break all of the rules because they don't understand the things that they're truly working with. And so in the end, they're the same. So Uncle Andrew is sort of, he's like a small tree in the lust for power, and Jadis is like a big oak tree of lust for power. Okay. Now the thing is that parallel, she says that they both say the same sort of things, have the same sort of look, evidence the same sort of mentality. The reason Lewis is showing us the one in sort of smaller form and then one in big evil form is that Diggory's on the same path. Okay. Diggory's on the same path. When, he himself at various times gets wild with curiosity. I got to find out what happens if I ring that bell. I just got to know. I got to do. I'm willing to break the rules in order to find out things. And then when Polly says, "Don't be silly. That's the terrible idea. There's danger. Why would you do something foolish like that?" He shoots back and says, "Oh, you're just a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged." And then Polly says, "You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that." Okay. So in other words, he said, "Oh, you're just a girl, very dismissive, very patronizing. You're just simple. You don't really care about important things." And Polly says, "You look like your uncle." And it's right. It was Uncle Andrew and Jadis in seed form. So if this is the mature oak and this is sort of the mid-range tree, this is it in seed form. And then Diggory says, "Why can't you keep to the point? What we're really talking about is this other thing." That's what Uncle Andrew would do. "You keep getting off the point. Why do you keep getting stuck on obeying the rules? Why do you keep getting stuck on doing kindness and being faithful and keeping promises? You're getting off the point. That's not the point." That's how Uncle Andrew thinks. And Diggory shows the same thoughts. We also see that Uncle Andrew, whenever he meets Jadis, is like, "Wow, she's an amazing woman, a damn fine woman she was, very strong, very brave." Diggory has the same reaction, right? She's wonderfully brave. She's strong. She's what I call a queen. And then Diggory doesn't have any regard for Polly's safety, just like Uncle Andrew didn't. So we see the same sorts of impulses in Diggory that we see sort of full grown in Andrew and Jadis. And so we're supposed to put ourselves in Diggory's place. And we're supposed to learn to recognize the temptation when it first confronts us. And we part of this is even, there's one point in the book towards the end where Aslan says to, I think it's to Diggory and Polly, that our world, meaning the world we live in, England and America and everything, you're growing more like Charn. Okay, you're becoming more like the world that was destroyed by the deplorable world. It might be that some wicked person of your race will find out a secret as evil as the deplorable world, the deplorable word, and use it to destroy all living things. Well, I think what Lewis actually has in mind here is something like nuclear weapons. Okay, it's that sort of thing he has in mind. Like here's this amazingly, and of course he's writing this book after the war, and so everybody knows what a nuke can do, and he's going, this is a really scary thing. This is like the deplorable word. Okay, and you need to be careful about what your scientists, you're able to split that atom. Should you though? Is that really wise? Do you know what you're doing, or are you dabbling in things that are above your head, and you're willing to break all the rules in order to do it? Now, at the same time, the encouraging thing about this sort of progression from Diggory to Andrew to Jadis is that Diggory gets off that path. Okay, so Diggory does see through Uncle Andrew. So when Uncle Andrew says, high and lonely destiny, at first Diggory's kind of tempted, like, I think, wow, that sounds really noble. And then all of a sudden he goes, wait, all it means is he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. That's a really good, so part of what Lewis does this in the Narnian Chronicles, he also does it in the Space Trilogy, where he tries to kind of show that for all of the high sounding rhetoric, the high and lonely destiny, the great rhetoric, at bottom, it's just, you want to do what you want and you don't care who you hurt in order to do it. That at bottom, you're no different from a child who simply will do anything he likes to get anything he wants. That's just, it's the same impulse. It's just, you've learned to display it in a very high sounding, noble sort of way. And Lewis is always trying to expose the truth underneath the rhetoric. And so Diggory, though, is able to recognize it. And Diggory also lives within the Tao. In other words, he respects the order of the universe. He's repulsed by Uncle Andrew's callousness toward children and animals. Like, he doesn't like it. He thinks he's a coward. He's attracted to virtues like faithfulness and promise keeping and compassion and loyalty. And his friendship with Polly actually really helps him here. The friendship they have actually strengthens those natural virtues. And then a really big one is when Diggory at one point, gives in to his impulse, his curiosity, his desire to know and put others at risk when he rings the bell and wakes up Jadis. And then later he's confronted by Aslan. And it's a really important scene because, so this is when Aslan is asking him, how did the witch come to be here? So let's see here. This is the boy who did it. And Diggory's like, what did I do? Son of Adam, there's an evil witch in my new land of Narnia. How'd she get here? And a bunch of different thoughts flood through Diggory's mind, like excuses. I don't know. And Andrew brought her, but he had the sense to say nothing except the truth. So he didn't try to make excuses. He just says, I brought her, Aslan. And then, okay, why? What purpose? I want her to get her out of my world and back into her own. And I thought I was taking her back to her own place. How'd she come to be in your world? By magic. And then it says, the lion said nothing. And Diggory knew that he had not told enough, right? So magic, that's how she got there. Okay, it was my uncle. My uncle did it. He sent us out of our world, and he sent Polly first. And then we met the witch in the place called Charn, and she held on to us. And then Aslan says, you met the witch? In a low voice that had a hint of a growl in it. And then Diggory says, she woke up. And then turning very white, he says, I woke her. So notice that. The shift from we met the witch to the witch woke up to I woke her up. Okay? That's a move toward taking responsibility. That's a move toward honest confession. And it's what makes the difference between Diggory and Andrew. I wanted to know what happened if I struck the bell. Polly didn't want to. It wasn't her fault. I fought her. I know I shouldn't have. I think I was a bit enchanted by the writing under the bell. So that was what he said. I think the enchantment, I was enchanted. The enchantment made me do it. And Aslan says, do you think you were enchanted? No, I wasn't enchanted. I was only pretending. And so this is a really key moment, though, because it's Diggory taking responsibility for his own choices. Okay. He gave into that impulse, that lust for power, that curiosity, and now he's owning it. And this is what makes him different than Uncle Andrew, who never does anything of the kind. When he meets Aslan, this is what solidifies it. When Aslan breathes on him, gives him a kiss, and that gives him new strength and new courage. And now he's going to obey and repair what he's broken. That breath is what keeps him firm in the face of temptation. We'll talk more about that maybe a little bit later. And then his relationship with Polly is really key, because whenever he meets the witch and she tries to get him to break the rules in order to do what he, to do whatever he likes in order to get whatever he wants. That's the temptation she does. Don't listen to Aslan. Don't take the fruit back to him. Take it and give it to your mom. Make your mother well again. You can make your mother well again. And Diggory's like torn by this. He's like, oh no, I feel the force of that temptation. And so he's thinking about doing it, but then all of a sudden the witch says, no one has to know. No one in the world needs to know anything about the whole story. And then the witch says, you needn't take the little girl back with you. In other words, you could leave her here. You might even, take care of her. And it says that was where the witch made her mistake. Because of course, Diggory knew that Polly could get away by her own ring. And then the meanness of the suggestion that he would leave Polly behind suddenly made all the other things the witch had been saying to him sound false and hollow. In other words, the witch went too far and Diggory recognized it, and it sort of unraveled the whole spell that the witch was weaving on him. So he was tempted. He was thinking, I'll break the rule in order to get what I want, just like she does, just like she did, just like Uncle Andrew. But then whenever she sort of says, leave the girl behind, he's like, whoa, that kind of snaps him out of it. It's that robust friendship and loyalty he has is part of what breaks him out of his spell. So that's the Diggory and Uncle Andrew and Jada's thing. And then as a result, one of the interesting things about this is that because he obeys, because he keeps first things first, okay, so he obeys Aslan, even though it means he's not going to take the apple back and save his mom, like the witch says. He doesn't take the shortcut. Because he goes the long way and seeks to obey Aslan first, he actually gets an apple that heals his mom. But first thing, Lewis said this, you put first things first, you get second things thrown in. You put second things first and you lose both first and second things. So this is what the witch discovers, right? So she seizes the apple, and so she loses the pleasure of the apple. It's abhorrent for the rest of her days. The smell of that fruit is disgusting to her because she seized it illegitimately. So she didn't get the power she wanted. She didn't and lost the pleasure of it. She got powerful, like she lives forever. So it does work at some level, but she loses joy. She loses life, true life. Diggory, on the other hand, rejects the false infinite. He rejects that sweet poison. And because he rejects the poison, he gets both the good that the ultimate good, Aslan, well done, good and faithful servant, and Aslan throws in the lesser good. I'm going to heal your mom. And so that's the lesson. That's what Lewis wants us to see by showing the path in its fullness, and then showing Diggory's heading down that slope. He's going that direction, but then he veers off. He makes the right choice. He confesses his sins. He has the good relationships, and because of that, he's spared from ending up down that path. Let's think. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. Maybe a couple more thoughts on this. In describing all of this, Lewis gives us a couple of key windows on sin. So at one point he describes sin as basically doing things. Find the page here. So this is talking about why the witch is because she stole the apple, why is she going to hate the smell of the apples for the rest of her days? Child, this is Aslan, That's why all of the rest are now a horror to her, because she ate it illegitimately. This is what happens to those who pluck and eat fruits at the wrong time and in the wrong way. The fruit is good, but they loathe it ever after. So that phrase, plucking and eating fruits at the wrong time and in the wrong way, is Lewis's definition of sin. So sin is doing something that in itself is good at times and or in ways or in degrees that God's forbidden. So this is sort of sex is good, but only in its proper place. Honor is good, but only in its proper place and its proper time. So all of these things are good. All of them are made by God and they're good, but we can seize them at times or in ways or in degrees, taking them in the wrong way. And that's what makes them evil. And so they'll still have a sweetness, or at least a temporary sweetness, because it's a good, but then in the end, we'll loathe it. It'll turn to dust in our mouths. So there's a little description of sin. He does something similar about hell. So he says, things always work according to their nature. The witch has won her heart's desire. She has unwearying strength and endless days like a goddess. Here's the key. But length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery, and already she begins to know it. Okay, that's hell. Okay, length of days with an evil heart. So your unending life, but with an evil heart, that's hell. That's what hell is. And so she's chosen to dive in to her own hell. All get what they want. They do not always like it. So the witch got what she wanted. She gets unending life, but she's miserable because she rejected the ways of Aslan. She rejected the Tao. She rejected the God-given order of the universe, stepped outside it, and she got what she wanted, and she loathed it ever after. Maybe the last bit here is two other little bits about this, and then we'll open up for questions. One is truth suppression. So one of the interesting things about Uncle Andrew and all this is the way early on in the book, he has to suppress the truth. He doesn't want to see who he really is. So this is the opposite. Diggory was honest when Aslan growled at him, or kind of sort of growled at him. He came clean. He was honest. Andrew has a similar moment of choice early on in the book when Diggory, when he's talking about how he's a great, magician and all this sort of stuff, and that Diggory, you need to go rescue Polly. You need to be chivalrous, rescue the lady in distress. And so Diggory says, all right, I'll go. But there's one thing I jolly well mean to say first. I didn't believe in magic until today, and I see now it's real. Well, if it is, I suppose all the old fairy tales are more or less true. Okay, so I didn't think magic was real, so I didn't think fairy tales were true. Well, magic's real, so fairy tales probably true. And then he says to Andrew, and you're simply a wicked, cruel magician like the ones in the stories. Okay, so that's what you are. You're the wicked magician. That's who you are. Well, I've never read a story in which people of that sort weren't paid out in the end, and I bet you will be, and serve you right. And then, so in other words, hey, you need to know what kind of character you are in this story, Uncle Andrew. You're the wicked magician. What happens to the wicked magician in fairy tales? And then it said, the narrator says, of all the things Diggory had said, this is the one that went home. This punch landed. All of a sudden he's like, whoa. And all of a sudden he kind of was seeing himself as he really is. But a second later, he smoothed it all away and said with a laugh, well, I suppose that is a natural thing for a child to think, brought up among women, as you have been. Old wives' tales, eh? I don't think you need to worry about my danger, Diggory. Why don't you worry about your little friend, okay? So in other words, he has this moment of self-knowledge. Diggory's punch lands, and it helps him to see himself as he really is, the wicked magician who's going to get it in the end. But he shoves it away. He rejects it. I'm not going to think that. And this is what Uncle Andrew does again and again and again. Later in the book, when Aslan is singing Narnia into existence, when Aslan's singing, Andrew dislikes the song very, very much. It made him think and feel things he did not want to think and feel. And so whenever the sun comes up in response to the lion singing, he says, no, the singing didn't do it. The lion, who ever heard of a lion singing? And the longer and more beautiful the lion sang, the harder Uncle Andrew tried to make himself believe he could hear nothing but roaring. Okay, so the more that he sings, the more he tries to suppress it. He's not singing. That's not why the sun came up. That's not why the stars came out. And then Lewis comments, The trouble about trying to make yourself stupider than you really are is that you very often succeed. Right? That's a zinger right there. Trying to make yourself stupider than you really are, trying to suppress the truth, trying to hold it down, you can succeed in that. And so by the end, when Aslan says, Narnia, awake, Andrew can't hear what Aslan's saying. All he hears is barkings and growlings. When the animals are talking, he hears none of it. All he hears is animal noises. And it's not because they're not speaking. It's because he's deafened himself. He's blinded himself. He can't see what's really happening. He's chosen that kind of blindness. Lewis goes on later to say, what you think and feel. Let me see where it is. I cannot comfort him. He has made, this is Aslan saying, he has made himself unable to hear my voice. He has made himself unable to hear my voice. He has suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, and therefore he can't hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would hear only growlings and roarings. O Adam's sons, how cleverly you defend yourselves against all that might do you good. Okay. So in other words, he can't hear it. He's suppressed the truth so much that he's now deaf to Aslan's voice. So that's another thing. Lewis is really playing up the what it means to reject the good. You turn the who you are into something different than you were before. And so Andrew's hardening his heart. This is a Pharaoh-like move. He's hardening his heart, and he can no longer hear Aslan's voice. Last thing on this. When there's a key moment, it's a real puzzle. If you've been paying attention to the other books, there's a moment in the stories where after Diggory gets back with the apple, okay, and gives it to Aslan, and Aslan's telling him about the witch is going to loathe it forever. She's gotten what she wants, but she doesn't like it. And Diggory says, I nearly ate one myself, Aslan. I almost gave into the temptation. Would I? And then Aslan says, you would, child. Now I want you to pay attention to that word would. Like, would I have ended, so in other words, would I have ended up like her? Would I have gotten endless days like a god, but then been absolutely miserable? Because I would have sinned, I would have gone to hell. That's the question. Would I have gone to that? And Aslan says, you would, child. That's what would have happened. The fruit always works. It must work, but it does not work happily for any who pluck it at their own will. If any Narnian unbidden had stolen an apple and planted it here, it would have protected Narnia, but it would have done so by making Narnia into another strong and cruel empire like Charm, not the kindly land I mean it to be. And the witch wanted you to do something else, didn't she? Yes, she wanted me to take an apple home to mother. Okay, and then Aslan says, understand then, it would have healed her. So if you would have taken the apple, like the witch said, the apple would have healed your mother, but not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said, it would have been better to die in that illness. And so then all of a sudden, Diggory's, he's in tears. He gave up all hopes of saving his mother. And then he's realized that, man, there might have been things worse than losing someone by death. Okay. And then Aslan says this, that is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple. It is not what will happen now. What I give you now will bring joy. It won't give endless life, but it will heal. Go get the apple from the grand apple. Okay. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Twice before in the Chronicles, once in Prince Caspian, and then once in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Lucy asks Aslan what would have happened. Okay. So in Prince Caspian, it's when Lucy is, it's timely. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with Louis Marcos, who's a professor at Houston Baptist. I'm sure he's spoken at C.S. Lewis Institute stuff in the past, big Lewis fan, scholar, everything. And we were talking about this, and he pointed this out to me. So I had not made this connection. So this is from Louis Marcos for all of you. He said, in Prince Caspian, Lucy doesn't obey Aslan right away. Like she has to, when she's the only one who sees Aslan and he's trying to lead him down a path. And Lucy says, we need to follow Aslan, and none of the other kids can see Aslan. And so Peter's like, no, we need to go. So Lucy said, we need to go right. Aslan's to the right. Let's go follow him. And Peter says, I don't see anything. I think you're just imagining it. Let's go left. And they go left and they go long left and they eventually hit the dead end and they have to come back to where they are. And then she sees Aslan again and she says, Aslan, I tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen to me. And Aslan growls at her. And he says, what, you mean I should have followed? And he just looks at her like, yeah, you should have followed. And if I had, everything would have turned out all right. Everybody would have come. And then Aslan says, no one is told, child, what would have happened. So it's interesting, right? No one is told what would have happened. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, same thing. When Lucy looks in the magic book and she wants to do a spell that would make her as beautiful as Susan. And she runs that scenario down in the book, and she'd be, kings would fight over her, and she would be the most beautiful woman, and everybody would, wars would be fought over her beauty. She'd be like Helen of Troy. And she resists that spell. And the next spell is, here's a spell so that you can know what your friends really think. And she says, well, because I didn't do that spell about the beauty, I'll do the spell about knowing what my friends think. So she says the spell, and then all of a sudden she can overhear her friend talking about her. And her friend, in a moment of cowardice, basically throws her under the bus. Oh, that Lucy Pevensey, she's just a little kid. I don't even care about her. And this, of course, deeply offends Lucy. She's like, oh, how dare her? Well, when Aslan shows up, he says, I think you've been eavesdropping. Oh, well, was I eavesdropping? I didn't know that. But I didn't, but I'm glad I know. I'd rather know that she's a, traitorous little friend who throws me under the bus. And Aslan says, she was just weak. She was intimidated by the older girl. She's actually a really good friend to you, and she needs your friendship. And then Lucy says, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget what I heard. Oh, do you mean would we have been friends forever? We would have grown up and been, best friends all our lives if I hadn't heard that? And Aslan again says, no one's told what would have happened. I told you before, no one's told what would have happened. Well, no one's told what would have happened. No one's told what would have happened. And then here, Diggory's told what would have happened. This is a puzzle, right? This is really interesting. What's Lewis doing? Well, what's the difference between those first two scenarios and this one? In the first two scenarios, Lucy didn't obey, but wants to know what would have happened if she had. So she disobeys, she doesn't follow Aslan, and she says the spell she shouldn't say. And then their consequences fall out, right? They lose a day and a half. She loses this friendship. And she wants to know, well, would everything have turned out all right if I'd have followed you, despite my siblings? And would we still be friends? And Aslan says, you don't get to know that. On this case, Diggory obeys. He does what he should. And because he obeys, Aslan tells him what would have happened if he hadn't obeyed. Okay. So you see the difference between the two scenarios. So this is like when we ask, what would have happened if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned? Okay. Like what would have happened? And we can sort of speculate a little bit based on how the Bible sets things up. Maybe it would have been like this, or maybe it would have been like that. But no, we're not told. We're not told what would have happened if Adam and Eve had resisted the devil's lies and not eaten the fruit. We're not told what would have happened. We sort of have a shadowy view of it. But had they obeyed, this was it. If they'd obeyed, just like they would have known what would have happened if they didn't. God would have showed them. So if you obey and you get life, God will tell you about what would have happened if you hadn't obeyed, namely death. But if you choose death, you don't get to know about life. Does that make sense? So there's an asymmetry here, and Lewis is really trying to say, like, the path to the fullness of knowledge of both what will happen and what would have happened is obedience. If you obey, you know more than if you disobey. If you disobey, you cut yourself off from life, from knowledge. You don't get to be told what would have happened. But if you obey, you do. All right, that's probably a good enough spot. We've got about a little more than a half hour left. There's a bunch of other things I could talk about. I got some other here on the list, but let's go to your questions.
Okay, so first of all, this question from Isaac. Do you think Lewis was lampooning early science fiction authors like H.G. Wells with Uncle Andrew's elaborate explanation of how he created the rings? It seemed like a very classic adventure exposition, but he keeps getting undermined and interrupted by Diggory.
Yeah. So, so I'll say this about Lewis's relation to H.G. Wells. On the one hand, he had great respect for H.G. Wells just as an author. And so H.G. Wells, pioneer of science fiction, Time Machine, War of the Worlds, all of these sort of books. And so Lewis liked those kind of books. He liked them. He abhorred Wells's philosophy. He called it Wellsianity. So it's like Christianity, but it's Wellsianity. And it was materialistic, atheistic, Darwinian, dog eat dog, the world's out to eat you. And Lewis actually wrote the space trilogy, or the first book of the space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, as an answer to Wells. So in Wells's fiction, if there's stuff out there, it's going to be trying to eat us. And Lewis said, well, what if we're the bad? And so everything out there is evil, and we're the noble ones who are going to fight off the bad guys. So every alien invasion story you've ever seen. What if it was actually reversed? What if we're the actual evil ones because we're the ones who disobeyed? So Lewis didn't agree with Wells's philosophy at all, but respected him as an author. So it's possible here that he has Wells in mind as a way of sort of the journey to the, that's not Wells, it's Jules Verne, but that sort of adventure story and poking holes in it, going like, yeah, but that means you're an evil guy. Like if you, Uncle Andrew, you make yourself sound noble, but it's not actually noble. You blew up guinea pigs. How could you blow up guinea pigs? And he's like, well, what's wrong with blowing up guinea pigs? You do what you want. They were mine. I can do with them what I want. And so there is a way in which Uncle Andrew fits with that utilitarian, atheistic, no law above me. I can do, which we do see, I think, in some of the other materialistic, atheistic science fiction.
So someone asks, why do you think the creation of Narnia commenced as soon as humans arrived? Was it a coincidence?
It's providence. So this is providence. Aslan waits until the kids show up and everybody shows up in order to create, because this is how evil enters Narnia. This is where, of course, this is where the White Witch comes from. Is she's there for that initial thing, and they need to witness it. So it is providential. Aslan's behind all of it. He knows the story. In fact, of course, he brings them there, and then this is going to be King Frank and Queen Helen, the founding, the Adam and Eve, basically, of Narnia. And so he's got to get his Adam and Eve into Narnia, and this is the way that he chose to do it.
Okay. So again, we have one. Lisa asked, last time you mentioned to look for parallels between Diggory and Shasta. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. So this is a really fascinating one, I think, in that. One of the things that unites the story, The Horse and His Boy and The Magician's Nephew, is parental pain. Pain having to do with parents. So if you remember in Horse and His Boy, Shasta has an adoptive father who's basically abusive. He's cruel. Arshish is just a jerk. He beats him. Even when he's nice, he's not that nice. He doesn't love him. There's no love. So he has this abusive father, and we discover that's because he was orphaned as a young boy. He was stolen away and raised by this abusive adoptive father, and he's never known his real father. And because of that, everything goes wrong for Shasta all his life. And by the end of the book, he realizes, like, I'm the unluckiest boy in the entire world. Everything goes wrong. Okay, so obviously in this book, in Magician's Nephew, Diggory's mom, so like the book begins with mother is sick, and the book ends with mother is well. The entire narrative is framed by mother sick, mother well. Okay, and the deep pain in Diggory's life is, my dad's in India, and I love my mom, and she's gonna die. Right? She's got some illness, cancer, something like that. She's going to die. Interesting thing about both of those, the absentee, abusive sort of father and the sick mother, is that's Lewis's story. So Lewis and his brother, Orny, when Lewis was about 8 or 9 years old, his mom came down with cancer. And Lewis talks about this in Surprised by Joy. And one of the things he said is that in some ways the worst part of the cancer was the whispered conversations between grown-ups about what was going on. So they would be agitated, and doctors and coming, and his father being very agitated about the news, and he's just a kid and doesn't understand it, and everybody's trying to like kind of pat him on the head and send him away so that he doesn't really know. But the grown-up agitation was that was the worst. One of the worst parts of it was being sort of like knowing something's wrong but not understanding what it was, and he can't comprehend it, and he's sort of left outside. So his mom gets sick and she dies of cancer. As a result of her death, his dad kind of withdraws. He doesn't become abusive, as far as we can tell. Like he didn't. He's not an Arshish, but he loses both of his boys, is how Lewis describes it. Like the more that he withdrew, he became erratic, emotional. He ceased to be stable because Lewis's mom had kind of been the like stable rock of the family. Lewis says that Atlantis had sunk beneath, when she died, the island of Atlantis had sunk beneath the waves. And so Lewis, as a young boy, suffers sort of the absenteeism of a father and the death of a mom. And both of those show up here. But what's interesting is that in both of these stories, in the end, Shasta finds his real dad, King Loon, who ends up being, like I talked last time, the greatest dad ever, right? Smiley face, loves his sons, disciplines them, proud of them, first in, last out, laughing loudest, just the best dad ever. And Shasta gets the dad back, not the withdrawn, abusive, cruel, I don't care about you, dad. He gets the happy father back. And then in this book, mom doesn't die, mom gets well again. Okay. And so Lewis writes these stories, and they're personal. I think that there's a personal element to them. And somebody might look at that and say, okay, so Lewis is just sort of like working. This is like therapy. Lewis is working through his childhood trauma by writing these stories. And there's maybe a little bit to that. He's writing out of his own experience. He's writing out of what he knows. But the key thing in both is that in between the parental pain, absentee father, sick mom, and the parental restoration, happy father, mother well again, is the encounter with Aslan. Okay. In both stories, there's this deep, it's actually both of these encounters with Shasta and Aslan when they're going up the mountain, and Aslan's, beside him, and the thing is there, and he's like, who are you? Are you a ghost? I'm terrified. And then the lion says, tell me your sorrows. And so Shasta pours his heart out and talks about all of the hard things he's ever gone through, all of the pain, all of the suffering, just pours it out. And then when he sees it's a lion, he goes up, and Aslan has tears in his eyes. And who are you? And Aslan says, myself, myself, myself. There's this sort of Trinitarian thing happening there. So who am I? I am. It's sort of like, I am. It's a Trinitarian statement. So he comes face to face, and he kneels, and he doesn't know what to say, and he doesn't have to say anything. He's just in the presence of Aslan. And this is like the turning point for him, is he gets Aslan, and that's enough. And then later he also gets happy father. Okay. So there's that with Shasta. In this book, you have a similar thing. Where Diggory wants, give me something to make mother well. And Aslan instead gives him a mission and says, go put things right, go get the apple, and doesn't make any promises, doesn't say, and if you do, I'll give you your mom back. He just says, you have to put right what you broke. You have to fix it. You have to obey. Here's your charge. Will you do it? Are you ready? But before he goes, Diggory has this breakdown, and he just like falls into tears, and he says, but could you please give me something for mom? She's sick. Can I have my mom back? And his eyes fall. And when he looks back up, there's tears in Aslan's eyes. And Aslan says, my son, I know. Grief is great. Only you and I know that in this world. Okay. In other words, he connects, Aslan connects with Diggory in his pain and grief and loss, and says, I know, I get it. And and then he breathes on him, and that gives him courage. And then it's a really crucial thing, because then later in the book, when after the temptation, and he's wondering, did I do the right thing? I didn't do what the witch said. I'm obeying Aslan. And it's whenever he remembers the lion's tears, he knows he did the right thing. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, the encounter with Aslan is what like steels him for the hard obedience of, I'm not going to take the shortcut. I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm not going to listen to the voice of the witch. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to obey Aslan, even though there's this other thing that I really want, a second thing. There's a second thing I really want, and I could get it. I could seize it. And he remembers the tears, and he's like, I'm doing the right thing. I'm sure. I know that I'm doing the right thing. And so the actual point of those two stories, as Lewis sort of works through his childhood pain, is that it's the encounter with Aslan that changes everything. Okay. It's the encounter with Aslan that matters fundamentally. The other stuff is bonus. And I think that there's a deep biblical truth here, in that. So Romans 8:32 is where Paul this is the, if God is for us, who can be against us, passage in Romans 8. And Paul says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? So you get that. So God gave you Jesus. He gave you Jesus, gave up his son, sacrificed his son for you. And if he did that, what else does what you think he's going to withhold anything from you in the end? He's going to give it all back. You're going to get everything you ever want. All things are yours. But it's first, he gave you Jesus. And then in the end, everything else. Graciously gives you everything, right? So that's the resurrection. That's restoration. That's new world. That's wiping away every tear. All of that stuff, all of the good things that we want right now, like the things that we want. We don't want loved ones to die. We don't want the pain and the loss and the ache and the tears. We want to fix all of that. And God instead says to us, I'm going to give you Jesus and he'll be enough. And then because I've given you Jesus, I'm going to throw everything else in. You put first things first, second things thrown in. Put second things first, you lose them both.
That reminds me of in Grief Observed, there's a point, it's about 3/4 of the way through the book, where after he struggled with all the questions and everything, Lewis comes to the point where he basically describes God as looking down and not saying really anything except, something like that. I understand your grief. And it's kind of a turning point in his experience. But I also remember that in the collected letters, Lewis mentions, he wasn't particularly big on Freud.
Right.
But he says, at this one point, Freud may have been correct that what happens, I'm paraphrasing here, what happens in the heart of a young man, because himself as a man, in regard to his parents, kind of shapes his understanding of the world moving forward. And that was certainly the case with, with his relationship with his mom, and her illness and his dad's response to that.
Yep.
So now let's see, Isaac asks, why do you think that Andrew's attitude towards the witch changes so drastically when she's present versus when she is not?
Right. So the basic thing here, of course, is when she's present, he's absolutely scared out of his wits and terrified. He mutters, he stumbles, he's totally out of sorts. And then when she's gone and her presence isn't as overpowering, all of a sudden he starts to imagine like, hey, I look pretty good. Maybe she'll fall in love with me. And I'm an equal to her. And then when she's present, he's like, he's a sniveling little, slavish, right, coward. And I think part of that is because when she's not, so when the real thing's not there, like the real evil, it's easy to imagine that we're bigger than we are. We talk a big game, and he thinks of himself. His entire life, he's thought of himself as the great magician, the high and lonely destiny. And then he sort of meets the real thing. Like this isn't just someone who's sort of a magician and learned how to read some magic books. This lady wiped out a civilization with a word. Like you're compared to that, Andrew, you're just nothing. And yet he's so used to and accustomed to thinking highly of himself that when she's not present to remind him of how pathetic he is, he begins to puff himself up. That's how committed he is to his own self-exaltation and his own pride, his own vanity. Is he imagines when he reduces her and elevates himself when she's gone, and then sort of reality comes crashing in whenever she's present, and he just falls to pieces because he's got no substance.
Okay, so someone asks, do you think that Uncle Andrew was a cruel man before he began experimenting with magic, and magic simply made the cruelty more visible? Or do you think that he was pulled into magic by his godmother and made cruel because of it?
Yes, it's hard to know. Obviously, it's speculation either way. But I think if you look at, again, if you're reading Andrew as a sort of Diggory gone to seed. So think about Diggory. Is he cruel at the beginning of the story? Well, no, but he also isn't thoughtful, right? So he doesn't, in that moment when he rings the bell, his curiosity overrides his care for Polly and her wishes, right? She's trying to be sensible. She's trying to go, the thing says danger. It's talking about danger. Are you crazy? Maybe we should think about this before we just start ringing magic bells in other worlds. That's a reasonable response. He's in the grip of a passion, curiosity, and therefore is willing to do anything to sort of slake that curiosity and then sort of shift blame. Oh, it was an enchantment. And so it's not in that seed form, it's not cruelty and malice, but it's the kind of indifference to other people that will grow into cruelty and malice if Diggory continues to be indifferent to the thoughts of others, the views of others, the safety of others, if he just is indifferent to that, then he will become hardened in his cruelty, just like Andrew did. And it does talk about in the book at a number of places that because he had experimented on animals, he hated them more. So he's terrified of the talking animals, even though he doesn't think they can talk. He's terrified of them because he'd experimented on animals. It does harden him. And I'm trying to remember someplace else where I recently read, it may have been in Tolkien. Tolkien talks that way too, about the effect of sort of animal experimentation on human beings. Like there becomes a kind of callousness to suffering and callousness that Lewis would say, if a kid just likes to kick cats for fun, just throw rocks and hit cats, that's like over time, that's bad for his soul. It's doing something to him. Which is different than saying, don't go hunting, or if you work on a dairy farm or not dairy farm, a cattle farm, you got to kill the cows, just, butcher them. Like there's ways that you can do that faithfully, but recognizing what you're actually doing, like the gravity of it. There is a gravity to it as you do it. If you become sort of calloused and indifferent to it, you'll become cruel, and that cruelty won't stay put. It won't simply be about animals. And this is part of what Lewis thought about modern science, is he thinks that we may have gotten great medical advances by, digging up dead bodies and poking around, but he thinks we may have. So there was great blessing at one level. Look at all the medical advancements and the technologies we have. We know how viruses work, and we know how to, better about how to stop cancer and all this kind of stuff. So great physical blessings, but has it done something to our souls that's really hard? Like, in other words, does the callousness toward abortion and the medical advances, do those have anything to do with each other? And I think Lewis would say they do. There's a connection, and so they reinforce each other in those ways.
Why do you think publishers have changed the order of the Narnia Chronicles? I've always thought it was because they wanted to downplay the Christian message of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah, that could be part of it. I do think, so there's this, there's a letter that Lewis wrote to a little boy named, what's his name? Lawrence, I think is his name. And so in that letter, Lawrence is like an 8-year-old boy having an argument with his mom about what order to read them in. And his mom is saying, read them in the publication order: Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, go forward. And Lawrence is saying, no, you should read the creation story first and then the Lion. And Lawrence is asking, who's right, Lewis? And I think what Lewis is doing is humoring an 8-year-old. Okay. So I think he's just saying, like, he's not going to tell the 8-year-old, he's just trying to be kind of, and the kid's already read all the books as well. So it doesn't say, he's at the end of the letter, he just says, it really doesn't matter what order you read them in if you already know what's happened. But he does say, I think that your order makes sense. Start with the Magician's Nephew and go forward. And so because of that letter, all of the publishers now say that's what Lewis wanted. And I think Lewis forgot all of the little details that he had put in the stories that make it not work as well if you go Magician's Nephew to Lion as opposed to Lion, Caspian, and the rest, and ending with Magician's Nephew. I think Lewis just didn't. So I think objectively speaking, I really do believe this. If Lewis was alive and you sat down with him and said, okay, look here, look at this, look what you do in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You say this, look what you do in Magician's Nephew. You say that. Here's all of these little details. They make sense if you read them this way. They don't make sense at all if you flip them. They make zero sense. In Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he says, when they say Aslan is on the move, right? That's the first time Aslan's name is mentioned. Aslan is on the move, Beaver. The narrator says, now, none of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. If you've read Magician's Nephew, that's not true. You know exactly who Aslan is. You know that Aslan's the lion who made Narnia and sent Diggory, and you know all sorts of stuff about Aslan if you've read it first. So the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe doesn't make sense anymore. And it's a really important moment in the story. It's the moment of like awakening of, ooh, who's Aslan? And so you don't want to mess that up. And so I think Lewis forgot that. I don't think he was thinking about it when he was, he answered every letter that came to him, every single letter that was sent to him. He and his brother would spend hours replying to correspondence. I think he wrote a short little letter to an 8-year-old boy to humor him. And then the publishers are treating it like it's the Bible, which I just think is silly and stupid. And I don't know of a single serious Lewis scholar who thinks otherwise. I've never met one who thinks, no, the publishers got it right.
Okay, so Sandra wants to know, do you have any thoughts about who or what relationship Lewis was drawing upon when he crafted the witch, Jadis?
Yeah, so I think part of what's going on here with Jadis, so if we've talked at various other sessions about the Michael Ward's thesis about the planets in the Narnian Chronicles. So this is the Venus story, which makes a lot of sense. So Venus is the maternal planet, the feminine is feminine. So fertility, life, joy, softness, tenderness. And so it's a story about a mother being sick and getting well. It's a story about the bursting of life through the song. So there's all sorts of Venus imagery in the story. Well, there's a dark side of Venus too. Just like there's all the other planets, if they're taken the wrong way, could become bad. The planetary influences in the medieval mind were good. So Jove was good. Mars created warriors, or it created tyrants. The moon creates could create lunatics. That's the negative. You lose your mind, or it creates those who journey, those who wander but aren't really lost. So all the planets have good influence, but they can be turned bad if you take them the wrong way. Well, so how does Venus go wrong? And the answer is Jadis is how Venus goes wrong. She's beautiful. She's the most beautiful woman in the stories, right? Everybody talks about how she's this amazing beauty, but she's cruel and evil and all the way down. And so she's like an infernal Venus. She's a demonic Venus. And so I think that's what Lewis is trying to get at with Jadis in this story, is to communicate the great beauty that also masks the great cruelty.
So Marcia wants to know, do you think Andrew Magic and C.S. Lewis' portrayal of them are influenced by his experience with the man he had admired and surprised by joy that lost his sanity through occult experimentation? That was, I think, his cousin, or? Yeah.
So throughout his life, Lewis, the early 20th century was just filled with all kinds of stuff like that. There's theosophy, and Swedenborgians.
He had gone to a seance, hadn't he?
Yeah. So he did. Everybody thinks when God goes, atheism's what's left, and it's like that's not true. When God goes, the gap gets filled by something, and there was lots of weird somethings in the late 19th, early 20th century, and Lewis encountered a bunch of it. And so I think that he'd run, encountered people who had gone crazy like that through a cult and the seances, and he had one of his close friends became a theosophist, which is a little bit weird, kind of philosophical movement, Owen Barfield. And so Lewis was familiar with this and wary of it, and yet also saw some potential in it. In other words, those sorts of folks believed in the supernatural, unlike the Wellesian, it's all Darwinian evolution. There's nothing beyond matter and motion and random chance. And so even though he knew supernatural can go bad, naturalism is bad. And so Christianity is what brings those two together. It's supernatural, but recognize that there's spirits and there's spirits, right? Like there's the Holy Spirit, but not all spirits are good. And just because something's spiritual doesn't mean it's good for you and that you should mess around with it. And then he recognized that there's a commonality between, again, that occult experimentation, which is sort of he comments at one point about the famous story about Faustus. And we talk about the Faustian bargain, the guy who makes a deal with the devil, give me everything I want, be my servant for 20 years, and then I'll give you my soul. That's the sort of Faustian bargain. And Christopher Marlowe did a famous play, and Goethe did a play on Faust. Lewis comments about Faustus, I think it's in Preface to Paradise Lost, and says what Faustus is really interested in is all material stuff. He wants girls and money and earthly power, and he plays a lot of practical jokes. And so Lewis says at bottom, his desires are just normal human desires. He just wants to get all the power in order to get them as much as he can. So it's not like he's this grand noble, or even this like really, really evil guy when he makes his deal. It's like he literally wants gold. He literally wants to be the emperor. He just wants power. And so it's just he's willing to make a deal with the devil in order to get it. And so Lewis thought, yeah, that's the bottom line thing is people want what they want. They have desires. And if you remove any limits to getting what you want, any moral boundaries, you could do that in a couple ways. One is you draw some, weird markings on the floor and chant things backwards, or you get a microscope, right? You get test tubes and really big microscopes, and you start splitting stuff and poking around. Both of them are dangerous because both of them are fundamentally about power over nature. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do science, but Lewis has a vision of what he calls regenerate science, obedient science, science that goes, God made the world and we ought to respect the way it is and not simply treat it as though it's a playground for us to do whatever we want.
Mm-hmm. I remember a quote by Lewis where he said, the West may have to become pagan before it can become Christian.
Right. Yeah.
I think he recognizing that maybe, the pagan belief in the supernatural was actually closer to being open to true faith in Christianity than naturalism. So Isaac asked, do you think there's a reason behind how the witch's powers are affected by the world that she is in? For example, she couldn't use magic on Earth, but was super strong.
Yeah, so I think part of what Lewis is doing there is for all of her pretensions to sort of absolute power, she's still bounded, okay? So she still has limits. She thinks of herself as all-powerful, deplorable. I discovered the deplorable word and used it. And so she thinks of herself as all powerful, and that it's sort of like something that's inherent in her, like that she's God. And then her inability to like turn people to dust in London is a reminder, you're not God. Like you're not God. And in fact, when she shows up in Narnia and she hates the song that Aslan is singing, it says something to the effect of the witch knew that the song and that the magic she was encountering was stronger than hers, and that her magic was nothing in comparison to it. Right. So and because of that, she wants to, kill Aslan. She says something like she would burn the whole world down if she could, in order to make the magic. Let me find that line. It says, let's see. Ever since the song began, she had felt that this whole world was filled with a magic different from hers and stronger. She hated it. She would have smashed that whole world or all worlds to pieces if it would only stop the singing. Right? That's how far gone she is.
That you mentioned earlier about Hitler and the whole power thing, and Lewis referring to that. It's interesting that Hitler in his final days, the ultimate megalomaniac, he actually did command them to destroy. Basically, his, the way he positioned things was the destruction of Germany rather than surrender. So
Right.
he was so, it was either I win or
Right.
we destroy the whole thing.
Right.
So last question here. What is the root of choosing to be blind to the knowledge of who one is? Meaning when Uncle Andrew sees who he is for a moment, but pushes it away, what is the root of that? Why do some people have hard hearts? Is this simply pride?
Yeah, at one level, I want to say, yes, it is simply pride. And if you try, and here's one of the things that Lewis knows about evil. At bottom, evil is absurd. Okay. So we always want explanations. And so, and sometimes they're forthcoming. You can sit there and you can go, well, why did he steal it? Well, because he wanted that thing, and that thing's a good thing, and so he stole it, right? So you can begin to, you can understand sin up to a point, but if you keep pushing it back, and reality begins to become clearer, at bottom, there is simply an irrationality and absurdity, and it becomes really clear if you go. The Bible says you could have the glory of God, like God offers Himself freely to Adam and Eve. I'm your father. I've provided everything for you. There's one no in a world full of yes. And you go, what could be easier than having all of your needs met by a loving father, and all you had to do is not eat that one thing? And how could they do it? And then we want to go, well, the serpent tricked them. It's like, that's true. Why'd the serpent do it? Like, where'd his evil come from? And so John Milton in Paradise Lost had kind of explored that sort of question. Lewis was a scholar who wrote on Paradise Lost. And in that, there's a line in Paradise Lost where the devil, in thinking through, recognizing like God's stronger than me, he's going to win, I can't win this, and then says, therefore, I'm going to continue to rebel. And he says, therefore, evil, be thou my good. Like, I'm just going to double down on the evil. And Lewis comments and says, this is basically saying, nonsense, be thou my sense. Absurdity, be my sense. I choose absurdity. And so in choosing evil, you're choosing the absurd. It doesn't make sense. And so at one level, yet pride is a good word for it. But what pride is this, it's this irrational and insane desire to put yourself first when you're not first. It's this choosing the self over the joy, over reality, over joy, over God. And so, and Lewis dramatizes this in almost everything that he writes. Great Divorce, Till We Have Faces, all of these books, Narnian Chronicles, Space Trilogy, all of them are basically getting at that fundamental. Are you going to put yourself first, or are you going to put God first? And if you put yourself first, in the end, it looks insane. Like when you see it, you go, how could you possibly do that? How could you have self-knowledge like Andrew does, sort of puncture it? And then you go, no. Same thing with Pharaoh. How could Pharaoh harden his heart? God just showed it, told him 10 times, I'm stronger than you. I'm God, you're not. And yet he still persisted. And there's obviously complexities there of God's sovereignty and human freedom and responsibility. It says that God hardened his heart, and then Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and his heart was hardened. And all of those are, there's, you can get into like the mechanics of how that works. But at one level, one answer to that question is there is just a fundamental absurdity and irrationality and insanity of exchanging the glory of God for lies, exchanging the glory of God for images, exchanging the glory of God for self. It doesn't make sense.
So when you were talking about that, it reminded me of a quote from Mere Christianity, where Lewis said, what Satan puts into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they would be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, and invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery. The long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy.
Yeah. Yep.
So with that, I just would mention again, if you're speaking of Mere Christianity, if you're interested in being a part of our community involvement with Mere Christianity, check out Further Up, Further In, which is if you're here in the Atlanta area, we'll be offering this fall, and you can check that out on the website. And as we leave, thanks again, Joe. Very insightful, and maybe you could say just a few words about our last book.
Yeah. So Last Battle, for 2/3 of it, it's like the most depressing book you could imagine. And so maybe one thing would be, as you read The Last Battle, notice what happens every time the good characters, Tyrion and the rest, what happens when they make a decision. So that they'll make a plan and start to carry it out. And I just want you to pay attention to what happens every time they take action. So notice that. And then, of course, we'll talk at length about the ending vision, the ending last quarter of the book or third of the book, which is the further up and further in. Maybe a good place to end here, since we ended on a little bit of a sober note with the absurdity of evil. The flip side of that, Lewis speaks to at the very end of this book, when Aslan's going to send Diggory and Polly back to their own world. And here's the thing. This is a beautiful scene. It's designed. There's a number of places in this book where Lewis is attempting to describe and awaken a longing and a desire for joy, for God. So here's what it says. Both the children were looking up into the lion's face as he spoke these words. And all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened, the face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating. And such a sweetness and power rolled about them and over them and entered them that they felt they had never really been happy or wise or good or even alive and awake before. And the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so that as long as they both lived, if ever they were sad or afraid or angry, the thought of all that golden goodness and the feeling that it was still there, quite close, just round some corner or just behind some door, would come back and make them sure deep down inside that all was well. So so you can either, that paragraph, the sweetness, the goodness, and the power around, that's just ever present and everywhere and offered, you can either awaken and stoke that desire, that longing, and use it in the fight for joy, or you can suppress it like Andrew, and eventually silence it forever. But that's what God offers to us.
So I know again we're a couple minutes over, but it just feels like we wouldn't be doing the book service if you didn't finish with maybe just a few comments on the creation and the whole music and laughing and that kind of thing in the creation story there. So
yeah, so Lewis is clearly picking up on some of the imagery from the Bible about when God laid the foundation of the earth, the morning stars sang for joy. He actually has the stars sing in the book of Job. And so this notion that, in the Bible, God speaks the world into existence, utters it by his word. But then it mentions this sort of singing. And so Lewis just really plays that up. It was a pretty common thing. Tolkien does a similar thing in his creation account in the Silmarillion. And that then Lewis, in having everything sort of burst forth with life, and then the jackdaw and his joke, that God sort of gives them the gift of laughter, is a part of God's kindness and goodness as well, and is meant to bring with the in the beginning was joy, in the beginning was life, in the beginning was laughter, and yes, Jadis comes in and wrecks it, and yes, there's pain and sorrow, but the beginning was joy, and in the end, that's all that will be left.
Amen. What a great place to end. So thanks again. And thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next time.